I think that speech was so eloquent that I should just ask for questions and answers. Because he did summarize everything I'm about to say, and maybe he said it better than I will tonight. But let me try to build on what was said, and I think it's important to maybe amplify a few points. So the first point I would make is the point that we face many challenges. I don't need to tell you that. I think it's also clear that the election, concluded about a week ago, settled very little. And in fact, I think it's a fair assessment to say that neither candidate addressed really many of the pressing issues that face us today. We know there's slow growth in the economy, unemployment's still pretty high, and the prospects for substantial growth in the near future are not so great. And we know, especially in Illinois, where the deficit problem is substantial at the state level, there are substantial deficits at all levels of government. And of course, many commitments continue to increase. And so we see a lot of problems and not so many clear solutions. So that's why I'm very happy to be here tonight and to hear about what your initiatives are. I'm especially happy to be here because of this beautiful building. I've been here before, but I've never really seen it filled with people, interested people. I've certainly never spoken here before. But just like this is a creative building, I think this is a creative community. And I think it's gratifying that you are, in the face of difficult times, doing something big. And I'm going to try to support the wisdom of your approach and to try to frame it maybe in a way that's slightly different. So, you know, the challenges are out there. We have economic inequality, a divided society, and polarized leadership. There's some signs that maybe after the election, some of the polarization may decrease. I hope so. We certainly have a divided society. But what we have missing in the current discussion is leadership. That's evident here, of course, but not at the national level. I don't even think at the state level. To embrace the facts, and I think it's very important, maybe more important than ever before, to have an empirically grounded public policy that actually is hard-nosed, that evaluates what works, what does not work, and that essentially helps us prioritize. And so I want to just briefly review some dismal statistics, but statistics that nonetheless make their way into public policy discussions. About a year ago, we all saw versions of this chart. Without going into great detail, this is showing you that the whole notion of the 99% versus the 1% is not a triviality. That if you look at the top 1% of family incomes and you look at their growth since 1980, they've really taken off at a very high level. And we've seen very stagnant growth in wages for most workers in the middle class. And so this was an issue. President Obama has talked repeatedly about growing the middle class. And really, in some sense, what I'm talking about is a strategy for doing that in a very productive way. So the middle class is under stress. There's a housing market, the underwater mortgages, and persistent problems like crime, health care, and the like. And in fact, what we've seen in the political dialogue is actually very little notion of how it is that we can address these problems with some kind of unified strategy. And so what I want to say is what's already been said, and it's a truism. It's certainly a truism that the skills of a nation, the skills of a town, of a district, of a neighborhood, a town like Oak Park, skills are the major source of the productivity for the local economy and for the national economy. They're also the major determinant of social advantage and disadvantage for most people. And we know from many, many discussions and many estimates by economists around the world that technology has changed in a way that shifts towards more skilled workers. And the wages of highly skilled workers have increased, whether it's in Central Africa or whether it's here in Oak Park. There's a huge demand for skilled labor. But what many people haven't fully appreciated, and I don't think was really adequately documented in the discussion, even in the election, is the following statistic, or the following statement. It was about the squeezing of the middle class, or what I call the decline of the American blue-collar middle class. This is a graph that takes us back almost a century, actually to a time before this church was built. But it actually shows that phenomenon that was a typical American story for cohorts of people born up to about 1950. And what you see is a steady growth in the fraction of the workforce, the fraction of the population, I should say, that graduates from high school. every generation produced a more successful generation that followed them, and that there was a sense that we were promoting and improving ourselves. And that was always the great American dream, to try to promote inequality, try to promote equality and opportunity. And education was a principal vehicle for doing so. And what we've seen, if we look at the college graduation rate, is over that same period of time. Now this is, remember, birth cohorts of people, 1900. So if they were alive today, they'd be 112. Not many alive, I assume. But certainly many people born around 1950 are here in the audience. And we can see that up to that period, around people born in that period, each generation before them had less high school graduation, less college graduation, and there has been a steady increase in college graduation rates, although substantial differences by gender. We've actually seen very little growth in male college graduation rates. Most of that growth is actually among women. But if you look at the graduation rate for the high school, you can actually see that the high school dropout rate, properly counted, has actually increased. We're actually having a phenomenon that in 1980 cohorts, it's about the most recent cohorts, these people would be now in their 20s, late 20s, that these people, that cohort actually has a lower high school graduation rate. And this is not just a phenomenon of migrants coming in who have less education. Many migrants from Mexico come with less education. That's excluded. So whether we include or exclude, we're still finding that that the middle class, this group of high school graduates, this interior cohort is essentially starting to become evacuated. And so properly counted for men, the college graduation rate has been flat for 40 years, and the high school dropout rate has actually increased. So two Americas have emerged in the last 30 years, and the society is increasingly becoming polarized. So we have a decline of the blue-collar working class, and income and social class inequality have increased. But more important, and maybe in a more troubling way, we've actually seen that one of the Central American, if you want to call it myths or stories of success, the so-called Horatio Alger story, the rags to riches story, that American dream is actually starting to fade, if it ever really was so strong. So for example, a measure that economists take is what's called intergenerational persistence of income. How highly correlated the father's income is, say, with the son's income. It's easier to measure this for fathers than sons. We have very long-term measures. We can look at this, following sons and fathers about at the same ages, but looking across generations. Well, give you a benchmark. The correlation, which is a measure of association of how important your origins are, how important the conditions of birth are for your own income. In Denmark, that figure is about 7%. Very weak relationship between the father's income and the son's income as an adult. In the United States, it's about 65%. Much more highly correlated. The numbers are debated. Sometimes it's 50%. But the fact of the matter is we see a very strong correlation that early life conditions matter. And this has challenged the American dream. And this has challenged the whole notion that we're a society that really is offering mobility to the next generation. And so the strategy I'm really talking about is exactly what I think both candidates should have been talking about when they're talking about growing the middle class. It's not just a question of tax cuts. It's not just a question of whether we go back to the Clinton tax cuts or not. I think we need to take a much more comprehensive approach to skills, which are, after all, the main vehicle and the main avenue for success in American society. How can we formulate policies that recognize what skills matter, how they're produced, and how we should prioritize? And I think the key is prioritization. And I think what we have to do is avoid fragmented strategies, that they're very ineffective. I think a lot of American social policy will treat one problem at a time. It makes intuitive sense, but I think it's dangerous to actually think this way. Fragmented solutions don't work, and the problems need to be addressed at a core level. So here's an example of fragmented solutions. People would say, one, reduce crime. And so the natural thing to think about reducing crime is to have more police. But there's another way. Another way is to actually educate the individuals. We know that more educated children are much less likely to commit crime. And when we do a cost-benefit calculation, we can find that the cost of actually raising levels of high school graduation rate and reducing crime at the same level as, say, hiring a policeman are about a third or maybe less, a quarter of what the cost would be of actually hiring a policeman, training the policeman, and so forth. For example, so that's an example of one notion of a policy, saying for police, for crime, we should have more police. To promote skills, the natural solution is to build more schools, hire better teachers, raise test scores. And for the health problem, we should have more doctors and medical facilities. To reduce teenage pregnancy, we should conduct pregnancy prevention programs. And to reduce inequality, give cash transfers and promote housing. What I think is missing in all of this is a core idea of solution, a core idea of what I call pre-distribution rather than redistribution. A lot of the policies that we're discussing today are of a redistributive nature. The notion is we're transferring money from one group to another group. That discussion was dominant in the election. And what I think is going on in this is really thinking about a very fixed zero-sum society where one person's gain is another person's loss. What I'm suggesting tonight is a unified strategy that addresses all of the problems I talked about, crime, health, all kinds of problems, with a unified strategy of human development. And it's this policy of prevention and not remediation, which is much more costly. And so what I want to talk about is briefly what a strategy is, and just outline an argument about why skills are important. So what's the nature of the argument? Let me just summarize it briefly. So skills we know are important. But how do we produce skills? And that's what's missing in the public dialogue. We know that, and this has been studied by many economists, by sociologists, by many social scientists, that low levels of skills cause major social problems. They really do. Dropping out of crime, teenage pregnancy, all the problems I mentioned before. But what we have to also appreciate, and what's ignored in a lot of public policy discussion, and I would bet it's ignored here even in Oak Park, as progressive and as enlightened as you are, that skills are multiple in nature. That when we start evaluating what our public policy does, we have to have a broader notion of exactly what it is we should be looking for. So most current public policy discussions, especially about skills, focus on cognition, cognitive ability. So, for example, in the No Child Left Behind initiatives, those scores on tests, achievement tests, are used to judge the performance of schools and students in the schools. In OECD Europe, there's a huge competition every year, or every round of the so-called PISA tests, where countries compete against each other. Recently came back from China, and everybody in Shanghai was very proud that the Shanghai schools did very well on the PISA tests. But I think what we've learned from recent studies in economics and also in psychology is that cognitive skills, what we're testing and what we're focused on, are only part of what's required for success in life. What we've also come to understand is that personality skills, what are sometimes called soft skills, they're denigrated, physical and mental health as well. Sometimes personality skills are called character skills, although people sometimes don't like the association or the kind of prudish notion. But I'm really talking about skills like perseverance, attention, motivation, and self-confidence. These are important skills. They can be measured, and they can be enhanced. And so it's important when we devise skill policies, they have a much broader notion about what these policies should be enhancing and how we should measure the success of those policies. And I'll give you an example of that, and it's very relevant to the study of Head Start and many programs. But a second thing that we have to understand is that gaps in these skills between the advantage and the disadvantage open up very early in the lives of children. And what we also have to understand is that schools are contributing very little to the widening and narrowing of these gaps. That's not fully understood. I'll show you a dramatic graph. If you have the patience for sitting through that, I can also stop at any time and take questions. So I'm very, very, very flexible. But it's very important to understand that these gaps are opening up before school starts. And some of the gaps are already present at age 3. And another central theme that has to be recognized is that the family lives of young children are the major producers of these skills. And they, in turn, are major predictors of a lot of the crime, social problems, obesity, health problems, and so forth. And now we get to a very difficult issue, and one that's controversial, and that many people want to back off from, and that is the role of the family. The kind of policy that you're doing is really a family policy. And you have to understand that what you're doing is you're working with the family and you're supplementing the family. But this, in the past, was a very controversial statement to talk about the family, and I want to go into that controversial issue. Family influence extends well beyond the transmission of genes. These skills are not fixed at birth. They are not solely genetically determined, and they can be enhanced. So any successful policy really has to understand that what any successful policy is doing in investing in children is actually investing in families and working with families to improve not only the parents, but also the children, to give them certain advantages that they may lack, just left to themselves. So what we need to concern ourselves with is the powerful role of early family influence. And the reason why it's important to worry about it is that family environments in many countries, and of course in the United States, have deteriorated in the last 40 years. And that supplementing the family, engaging it in enriching the life of the family, and supporting the child in school, these are effective policies, and that's what these policies are actually doing. So we've learned that if society intervenes early enough in a consistent fashion over the life cycle of a child, it can promote. There's nothing fixed here, nothing that's so innately given that wears in a lot of malleability and flexibility. But when we think about the multiple channels of social, emotional, and cognitive skills as well as health, these channels percolate across the life cycle, and they percolate across generations. And they reduce a lot of problems. They foster workforce productivity. And they have an amazing feature. Not only do they build a skill base, so from a purely economic standpoint, just from a local economic standpoint, if saying, I want to produce the productivity, increase the productivity of the workforce here, you can also argue, yes, you're doing that, but at the same time, you're reducing inequality. This class of policies has a unique feature. It's both socially fair, reducing social inequality, promoting opportunity, and this is the amazing part, has very high economic returns. So we build a skill base, we have much higher economic returns, and we avoid a lot of social problems. So it has multiple arguments supporting it. How can all this happen? Well, I think we have to understand the importance of the early years. The return arises because of the dynamics of human skill formation. So this is natural, this is very intuitive, but there's a lot of formal research and work in neuroscience, work in economics, work across a number of epidemiology and the like. Life cycle skill formation is dynamic in nature. Skill begets skill, motivation begets motivation. And it's true, as it is in many organisms, not just humans, but certainly for humans, that the longer we wait to intervene, the more costly it is to remediate disadvantage. And so in the early years, we see a lot of malleability, a lot of flexibility. This is intuitively obvious. Whole cultures, the classics in cultures have actually written about this, so I'm not saying anything that is new. But what's new about it is that we've actually measured the quantitative importance of these ideas in a way that gives us much cleaner ways to think about how we reformulate our policy. So we really need to understand the dynamics of human skill formation and the important role of the family in producing these skills. So let me talk about these two notions, the importance of both cognitive and character skills. So we've seen major advances in recent work. Some books have recently been written. A book by Paul Tough. What's the title of the book? Success of Children, Building Success in Children. Do you happen to know the name? I should know it, but I don't. Anyway, it was a bestseller for a while. But the point is the main theme of that book, and it builds, and it just summarizes a lot of work, some of my own work and work by others, that character and these non-cognitive skills are extremely important. We had major advances. What do I mean by these non-cognitive or character skills? Things like motivation, sociability, attention, self-regulation. Sounds all soft and fuzzy, but we have a lot of evidence that these skills are both important and they can be produced. Let me give you some graphs just to show you a point that may be just beating a horse that's too obvious point here, maybe a dead horse, I was saying. It's not really the right image, but nonetheless, I think it may be an obvious point. But here's showing some example from some data where we go across the distribution. And here I can just use the pointer, I guess. So if you go from the bottom here on the left-hand side to the top of the distribution, whether it's in cognitive skills, so think of measures of like IQ, or in measures of self-control, what you see is that crime is reduced substantially when you go from the bottom of the distribution to the top of the distribution. And you get a similar figure if you look at teenage pregnancy. You see again that both cognitive and these non-cognitive skills matter. And if you ask who graduates from college, again, you see very substantial effects for both the cognitive and the non-cognitive skills. Let me just make a small detour and about a subject that I think is quite revealing, and my guess is still relevant here in Oak Park, as it is throughout Illinois and for our whole country. We have a program many of you know about called the GED program. The GED program is basically an achievement test that's given to dropouts from high school. It certifies that they're the cognitive equivalents of high school graduates. So the GED program is premised on a central premise of American social policy, that smarts matter, that what we capture by an achievement test matters, what no child left behind. Now, how important is the GED? Well, at one point, 1 out of every 5 high school credential in the United States was given by way of the GED, 1 out of 5. Now it's down to about 13%, but it's still substantial. Now, what came out of the study of the GED program is that these GEDs are as smart as high school graduates. They pass this test. This test does wonderfully well. The very tests that we use to measure our success and failure, those tests are showing, yes, the GEDs are just as smart. And yet, when we look at the performance of GEDs, whether it's in the military, whether it's in the workforce, whether it's in marriage, whatever it is they start, they drop out of. The same character trait that was missing, that caused them to drop out, unfortunately persists. I'm not saying there aren't some successful stories for GEDs, but the fact of the matter is that they're just as smart. So let me just show you a little bit of evidence. This is a graph. I'm an economist. I look at numbers, but this is this kind of familiar kind of a curve that is basically a distribution of cognitive abilities. The same story for men as for women, so I'm just showing the results for men. You see 3 graphs there. And this graph here on the left is basically the distribution of cognitive ability for dropouts. This is the distribution of cognitive ability for the GEDs, and this is for the high school graduates. Okay, so you can see that the GEDs are a little bit less, but they're certainly much smarter than the dropouts. So you ask, well, what happens to these GEDs? They pass the test. They're just as smart or almost as smart. What about their performance in getting, say, graduating college? Post-secondary educational attainment, getting a BA. You see that the GEDs are getting BAs at a much, much lower rate than ordinary high school graduates. And what's missing for the GEDs? Well, if you go back to the same format, you'll see that in terms of uncertified dropouts and GEDs, they both have low levels of non-cognitive skills, whereas the high school graduates are showing much higher level of non-cognitive skills. So this is one example of how important these other traits are. The missing ingredient, some people call it the dark matter of social policy, that we don't really measure but is central to understanding how we can promote success. So what's the strategy? I think we want to develop skills and abilities. I think it's the best way to solve the problems of economic and social inequality. So we've had a lot of discussion about income inequality and redistributive policies. But I think we want to avoid the mistakes that we made 50 years ago and mistakes that we detected as 20 years ago during the Clinton administration. So 50 years ago, in the heyday of the war on poverty, there was a tremendous desire to solve the poverty problem. And there was a real problem that Lyndon Johnson talked about. There, the notion was that if we redistribute income, gave transfers to the poor, and a number of other programs were launched, job training programs, many, many programs that still are with us today. If we redistribute income, though, was the central idea, the next generation will prosper, that a lot of the problems of inequality and the problems of social mobility would be cured. But what we tried, and again, a great legacy of the Johnson administration, was development of a system of accountability, of evaluation. And so we actually asked, did these policies promote intergenerational mobility? By redistributing income, we certainly solved the poverty problem. There was much less inequality in 1969 in the US than there was in 1964. And it wasn't just because the economy was tighter because of the Vietnam War. It was really, truly a redistribution of income that occurred. But if you ask, did the next generation prosper? It turned out it did not. And that was something that was staggering, that was troubling, and that finally led to the reform of welfare that President Clinton installed in 1995. So we need to think more broadly about how it is. How do people really escape the conditions of early deprivation? And what do we even mean by early deprivation? And so what I want to consider is that we want to think much more about these skills and abilities, much more about the capabilities that emerge early on and that play such an important role. But let me give you another figure which I think is very important. In much of the discussion, public policy discussion, there's a lot of talk about the black-white achievement gap. Who enters college and who does not. And here's the raw statistics as of about a decade ago. All these data are a little bit dated. I mean, you follow people over long periods of time. You don't get the most recent information. But I think this is still pretty accurate. So if you look at people who graduate high school, and you actually look at the gap between whites and blacks and whites and Latinos, you see a big 11 points gap, 11 percentage point gap between whites and blacks, 7 percentage point back between whites and Latinos. So that's a real issue. And it's an issue that concerns us today, and a huge amount of discussion devoted to this. People like Bill Bowen, Derek Bach, and many others have talked about policies like reducing tuition, other policies of improving high schools. A lot of discussion. The Gates Foundation is absorbed in trying to solve this problem, and properly so. But let me give you a statistic, which is pretty interesting, I think. If you simply control for the ability difference of these children at the time they're applying to college, what happens to that gap? It turns negative. So you actually see, and this is partly a result of affirmative action policies, it's partly a result of other policies. You can see now that actually holding constant the abilities of blacks and whites, you can see substantial differences, but now favoring minorities. So you say, wait a minute. If you had uttered these words 20 years ago, you might have been lynched. Because most people thought that these abilities were genetically determined, that there was nothing you could do about it. But what we've actually come to understand is that these abilities can be shaped. They are not genetically determined. They're not solely, there's a powerful role for genetics, but there's also a very powerful role for social policy. So before we leave the subject of genetics, let me leave you with something that could be considered a genetic effect. Here is the achievement test scores. Again, these are different longitudinal studies. We follow people in some cases up to 50 years in their lifetimes. Actually, I have a graduate student who followed entire cohorts of individuals born in 1910, followed to their death. But this is from a study done of children now in their mid-20s. We can look at what their test scores are at age 3. We can look at their test scores at age 5. And we look at the test scores at age 18. I just showed you that test scores are very important predictors. And once I control for these test scores, these are just the cognitive scores. There's a similar measure in terms of non-cognitive scores. But if I control for these scores, you can find very powerful predictors for the difference between, say, blacks and whites, between the advantaged and the disadvantaged who goes to school. Now, there are two features of this graph, and let me just tell you what they are. First of all, the upper graph is connected with mothers being college graduates. The bottom graph, mothers being high school dropouts. So you see substantial difference in the test scores. Nothing causal here, but it's a powerful association. But the most interesting figure is that those ability gaps that are there at 18 are more or less there at age 3. They're certainly there by the time kids are opening up school at age 5. The gaps open up early. And these gaps that play such a powerful role in predicting downstream progress are there at a very early age. Now this, again, doesn't dismiss the genetic interpretation. So 20 years ago, if a hardcore genetic determinist were here, they would say, well, this is smart kids, smart parents, they're just associated. And what we found, though, and what a lot of modern research has shown, is that it's not just genetics. What it is it's the genetic role, but the quality of home environments by family type plays a very important role. And that's what makes the following graph so troubling. Because family life has worsened for many children in the United States. Nobody likes to talk about this. In some quarters, it's called, it's become very, very controversial in the past. But I think now, as we understand the important role of the family and its conditions, we see across all American society, almost 30% of all children are living in single-parent families. And those families generally are families that are less rich in terms of nurturing the environment of the children, less rich in terms of parenting environments. It's not just a matter of family income, it's also a matter of how well the child gets exposed. And I'll give you some notion of how different they are. So let me just give you one other statistic that was carried in the New York Times last year, featured. If you ask what's the percentage of births to unmarried women in the United States, and these are generally associated with environments of more disadvantage for the family, for the child, you see close to over 40% of all children are in this position. And that's not just true in the United States. In Chile, it's over 50%. In Mexico, it's well over 50%. So it's a country, it's a worldwide phenomenon. Now, what do we know about those environments? Again, some work by my colleague, Jane Ellen Huttenlocher, has shown how much of a difference. This was already alluded to by the mayor. But if you look, for example, at mother's speech and child vocabulary in the first 26 months of life, just moving from the left to the right, you can see that the words, the vocabulary size of children from advantaged homes, and so we look at high level of mother's speech, that's on the top, and we look at low level of speech, you can see just even at the beginning of my graph at about age 3, you can see tremendous differences. That's even before they enter school. This is before they enter this period that even it was in my graph. And more stark is this study by Hart and Risley. Betty Hart just died last week. Her obituary was written up. But she documented this tremendous difference in the environments that young children are facing. So that typically a welfare family, a child in a welfare family, is getting something like 616 words in an average hour. But in a professional family, it's more than 3 times that. It's 2,000 words. And these things accumulate, and the rest of the tables here are just accumulations of this. So that at age 3, the benchmark of my graph, you're seeing substantial differences, that children are acquiring enormous differences in vocabulary. And they start from initial disadvantages, very hard to keep up with this. So what can we do about this? And what kind of social programs? Fortunately, there's a very large study where we can think about supplementing families. Early childhood interventions of the sort that you're talking about today and you're already implementing, I gather, in Oak Park. Early childhood interventions targeted at disadvantaged children are very effective in overcoming these gaps. And they're also very effective in overcoming the genetic argument. Because these are, in some cases, these early childhood interventions are targeted in a random way. Groups of individuals, disadvantaged children, some are assigned treatment, some are not. And what does the treatment do? Well, let me first of all describe the results and describe what the curriculum of more the successful programs would be. But what we've learned is that a primary avenue for which these programs operate is through personality and non-cognitive skills. Let me give you an example that may be familiar to those of you who learned about the so-called failures of Head Start. So what you see, and this is from the Perry Preschool program, a program that's now almost 50 years old, targeted in the 1960s, even before Head Start actually was in operation. And what did this program do? Well, this program took young children, they were 3 and 4 years of age, took them into a program, took them into a classroom or a small structured setting, I should say, and gave each child a task and said, well, you plan a task, you perform the task, and then you review the task collectively. So what it is providing guidance, a structured guidance. So children were sort of learning what I would call character and soft skills. Well, we followed these people. These people are now 50 years of age or so. We followed these people over their lifetimes. But we can also measure their IQ, the very measure that was frequently been used to determine whether or not these programs are successful or are failures. And you can see that at entry, it's a randomized trial. You would expect to find balance. And so on average, the kids were selected to be subnormal IQ. That was the basis for selecting them. But you can see in the first few years of the program, the treatment group children had a big surge, and then there was a fading out. By age 10, the treatment and control groups are basically the same. So if you use the same measure that Arthur Jensen was looking at in 1969, that many people have looked at for Head Start programs even today, these programs are failures. If you judge the success and failure of any program only by its achievement test or IQ measure, you're really missing some of the central ingredients. What did we learn from this program? When we follow this program, we find much less crime. We find very high economic rates of return. We can actually compute benefit-cost ratios, and we can actually compute what the rate of return would be. So a banker would appreciate this number. I mean, we have a rate of return of somewhere between 6 to 10% per annum for each dollar invested, which is a huge return. And it's much higher, for example, than the stock market returns pre-meltdown, say post-war, 1945 to 2008. And so when we start comparing these programs to other programs that are out there, like reduced classroom size, like hiring higher quality teachers, like job training programs, like criminal rehabilitation programs, we see much higher returns than we're seeing from alternative remediation programs. And so why does this happen? What's the logic of this? Well, it's very simple. There's a mutual reinforcing process, a synergism, if you will, where social emotional skills help produce cognitive skills. You teach a child to sit still and stay on task. You're really motivating the child to benefit from schooling. So there's almost an immediate benefit from these programs that you see in terms of reduced special education, retention, problems with children, and also later crime. The onset of adult, one of the major benefits of Perry was reduced crime. In fact, that helps explain for males a substantial part of this program's success. Reduced aggression, and we know the early onset of aggression is ages 3 and 4. But you also see dynamic effects. Healthier children are going to be going to school more, paying attention more, and be able to essentially acquire more skills. And higher cognitive skills translate directly into better health practices, more motivated children. So it's a synergism which really has to be exploited. And then the other side of the coin is, and the trouble is that the Great Society programs were very, this was a naive era close to 50 years ago. We didn't really understand that there was this prioritization within the life cycle of the child, that in fact there was this malleability and flexibility that was less evident for adult workers getting job retraining programs, or even for teenagers. So we've learned that late remediation is much more costly, and the way it's currently implemented, a lot of these programs are ineffective. So if you ask, what's the rate of return on public job training programs, does anybody have a guess? Like what's they had? Most people, in fact, I think both parties, I don't think it was actively discussed, but it was mentioned, Job Corps is a very popular program. Does anybody know what the rate of return is to Job Corps? 0. No, it's an experimental evaluation that was just conducted. It started in the Clinton years, and then it was finished in the early part of the 21st century. And literally, when you randomly assign people to Job Corps, some got treatment, some didn't, you find virtually no benefit. And in fact, if you do the cost benefit, because it cost them to keep them in Job Corps, no earnings benefit, and there was a huge loss. What's the effect of reducing classroom size by 5 students per pupil? Well, there are real effects on test scores and there are effects on earnings. But if you count the extra cost for teachers and schools, the rate of return is actually negative. It's cheaper, more efficient to give the kids money, put it in a passbook account, than to reduce classroom size. This is the kind of accountability that's missing in public discussion. We don't prioritize, and we didn't even in the great stimulus discussion of a few years ago. It's fallen out of favor. So when we do this, and we start looking at this, and we start looking at these programs, we find the remedial programs, maybe we can improve them. I'm not saying we shouldn't look at how to improve them, but what we really want to understand is that education, as we currently think about it, is a different and maybe less successful approach than early childhood. So early development is as important as education in promoting wages. Let me show you an example. We can actually study and decompose what the measured effects are of education. Let me show you a graph. This is actually from British data, but it's basically relevant, and there are similar calculations for the United States. This shows you what the advantage is of going beyond the compulsory schooling age, just not even graduating high school, in terms of the benefits. So the height of this graph, of these graphs here, is showing what's the benefit for men and women in terms of hourly wages, in terms of employment. So the height of this bar is really a measure of the success. Substantial returns to education as we typically measure it. Less obesity, better health, less depression, much less smoking. But now you go back and analyze how much of this effect is actually due to factors that were formed in the early life before people even entered school. We can measure that. So we can actually decompose this component. And so this blue line is a subset of what was there in the previous graph. And now I'll come back to the previous graph. And you can see that the early life conditions are contributing a substantial component. So nothing I'm saying says that education isn't important. But the early life conditions that not only create and promote education also have this substantial component of what we think of as the measured return to education. So let me just conclude and make a few remarks. The solution, I think, is to really understand pre-distribution and not to focus on redistribution as we have. Early investment produces returns that percolate over the whole life cycle. And we need to refocus public policy to really understand this prioritization. And so I would argue, you were talking about starting at birth. Well, there's a lot of evidence that suggests for severely disadvantaged families that even the prenatal years are extremely important. So when you're thinking about very high rates of we know, for example, from some of the work by David Oles and others, that mothers who are smoking, drinking, fetal alcohol syndrome is a major problem in certain disadvantaged populations. So if we look at the return to a unit dollar invested, and we just ask if we could take the child at the beginning of life and ask over the life cycle, where do we get the highest benefit? If we just imagine spending the first dollar, where would we get the highest benefit of the first dollar? Well, it would be in the earlier years. Years prenatal, 0 to 3, preschool programs, schooling, and job training. This doesn't say that job training has to be ineffective. But part of the reason why the return is so high early on is it builds the skill base for later investments. Because skills beget skills, it becomes much easier to invest later on in the life cycle, and therefore it produces that very high return. Now, economists looking at this figure would say, okay, that's the graph about where the return should be. Where should we do the major bulk of our investing? It should be in the relatively early years. And for middle-class children, that's in fact what happens. Mothering and early childhood is a very intensive activity, very expensive, as many of you know, no doubt firsthand. But we know that for disadvantaged children, the spending is actually opposite to this curve. We're actually spending more time in remediation, in jail, in counseling, and various other programs. And so this graph is not saying that the returns to job training are low or schooling is low for very high ability, very highly motivated children. In fact, we've estimated you get sometimes as high as 22% annual rate of return from a college education for a very bright and highly motivated child. But you have to give them the skill base in order to realize that return. And when you solve back and ask why is the return so high early on, it's precisely because it's creating the base that makes those later returns so profitable. So I think we need to spend our resources much more wisely than we currently do. So the smart investment strategy is to start by addressing inequality, which is disadvantaged early childhoods. And so today in Oak Park, you're avoiding the usual political strategies, and I think you're using common sense. I'm worried a little bit about the amount of money you were talking about investing per child, but I think you've moved beyond the kind of naive strategy, the naive notion of pitting the 99% versus the 1%. Or maybe everybody here is in the 1%, and so you're, but it didn't sound like it from the discussion. But I think what we want to avoid is going back to notions of just what poverty is really about and what child poverty is really about. And this requires that we need a broader strategy for thinking. I think our measures, even of child poverty, are very inadequate. It's not just money income. It's not money income, and this is something we've learned. We know that children from the Robert Taylor homes, when they still existed, some of the most severely deprived environments in Chicago, many of those children succeeded. And if you ask, why did that family succeed, or why did that child succeed, even if it was a single-parent family, and even if the mother didn't earn much money, what was present in the life of the child was a parent figure of some sort, whether it had to be the parent or a relative or some other element in their lives that essentially provided what early childhood programs are essentially providing, supplementing the life of the child, encouraging the child, and so forth. The conscientiousness of the mother has been identified as a major trait. She had a clean house, even amidst the slums and amidst the crime and amidst all the problems. So our measure of disadvantage is not adequate. It's not just family income. So what we need to do is target wisely these investments, think about pre-distribution, and I think that if, in fact, you follow this strategy and you promote this strategy, the whole region will benefit. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm certainly happy to take any questions if people want to stay around.
The first question for this evening is, last week, San Antonio, Texas, passed a local sales tax increase to fund a full-day preschool program at an annual cost of $37 million. Do you support such local efforts to invest in early childhood programs with local tax revenues?
Well, there's an interesting question that always arises in whether or not local communities, I mean, there are two different aspects of your question, or the question. One is whether or not the sales tax is the best vehicle. I'll put that to the side for a minute. But the second aspect of the question is, does it pay a local community to make these investments? I mean, the usual question is, well, people move. And precisely because you're not going to capture the benefits, maybe it's unwise. Maybe it's something for a national policy, but not for even for a state, and certainly maybe not for a community. Well, what we've come to understand, and there's a book actually by Timothy Bartek from the Upjohn Institute addressing just that question. And what's been found, and even found before him, he's just summarizing the evidence from this from a large literature, is that when you start looking at children who are disadvantaged, and we're looking at primarily promoting the high school graduation rate, high school graduates aren't really all that mobile. But certainly if you look at a regional basis, you'll find that the mobility rate of high school graduates from the country, from the city locality of birth is really pretty low. So that there are some benefits that accrue at least to the larger community that come directly from those benefits. But there is a question that about at what level the investment should occur. And it certainly is the case that San Antonio is now a big city and it has a fairly inclusive environment. I would say that my wife and I were there about 7 years ago, and maybe this tax increase had some, or this program had some, our visit had some consequence, because there was a lot of enthusiasm for early childhood. But whether or not we had any influence, I think the fact is that a lot of these benefits can be internalized. So on a purely economic ground, Bartek comes up with calculations, but really, at least on a regional basis, on a fairly locally regional basis, you're going to still see substantial benefits to the workforce and to the larger community. Not only reduce social problems, but enhance productivity of the workforce. You're going to have a better, that's one of the big problems now. I was just talking to Charlie Plosser, who's head of the Philadelphia Federal Reserve. One of the big issues in the recovery now has been that a lot of firms are hiring, but they're hiring at a higher skill level. They're requiring more skilled workers than are usually available. And we're talking about blue-collar workers or middle-skilled workers. They simply aren't being produced. And you can see from my graph that there was this shortfall. We really are having more high school dropouts at a time when we need more of the middle-skill ingredients. So there's a sense in which the community can really benefit from this. So there is, I hate to comment on the specifics of the San Antonio tax, but there is a logic that maybe isn't familiar. You know, there was always this discussion about college graduates, and for college graduates, it's less clear. If Oak Park were subsidizing people going to college, the fact is that college graduates are highly mobile people. And so you subsidize. So there were, years ago there was a discussion that Oklahoma had very heavy subsidies, but all the college graduates from Oklahoma were leaving Oklahoma, and there wasn't a lot of benefit. College, very high levels of graduation, of education have great mobility, but not so much at the intermediate levels. And that's what we're talking about, or at least part of what we're talking about here tonight.
Okay. Next question. What extracurricular activities are recommended besides the obvious of reading? For example, dance class, after-school programs, etc.
Well, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about first of all, it's the engagement of the child. And the engagement of the child, we understand now, in the sense of motivating children, keeping them on task, that these extracurricular programs, whether it's chess, or whether it's a sport, or whether it's some other musical activity, for example, that engaging the child and getting the child early experience with success and enthusiasm has huge benefits across the spectrum. I can't comment on ballet in particular as a particularly effective, but it's the engagement that matters. And I think it's the engagement that's really important to produce and I think that's what we've learned. In fact, some of the more difficult environments for young children in the inner city schools have been environments where there are no extracurricular activities. The children, in fact, the schools are almost prisons, and after the school over the children go home and their parents aren't engaged in the school. You know, we understand that we really want to engage the parents with the school and the children engaged in a series of activities that support and develop these other traits. There's a big literature now just about participation in sports, for example, how that helps build character. I mean, these are bromides, these are kind of truisms, but we've seen work by for example, Judy Cameron at the University of Pittsburgh has done a lot of work on exactly how participation in sports after school or, you know, on the weekends, whenever, builds character and also builds important life skills. And she looks at the benefits of these and also the benefits even in academic performance. So I think there are substantial benefits.
Okay. All right, we'll follow up with the question about parenting. What kind of parenting class would you envision, and how would it be implemented? Should it be compulsory? Are there good parenting class examples from other countries that you could offer?
Well, this issue of compulsion, I think, is very important. But I think, look, these early I mentioned this focus on trying to work with the family. What we're doing here is a family policy. But it's very important to work with the family in a voluntary way. Compulsion is not going to work. In fact, I think what we need in these kinds of curricula is a lot of different programs, a lot of menus of choice. Because these early years have some very delicate features. These are the years not only when children are learning to read and write and stay on tasks, but they're also years when children are forming values, when their values are taught and transmitted across generations. And so I think it's very important to engage the parents in several ways, not only because the parents are with the child much more than a preschool teacher will ever be or school will ever be, but also because you really want to understand what the parents themselves value. I think there's a core set of values that everybody would agree on. And I think that core set of values that we can talk about promoting, but in a way that's voluntary, not coercive. I think coercion is not going to work. In fact, there are examples. I mean, in Holland, we were in Holland a few years ago. One of the failed issues in the curriculum in the Dutch schools, some of the Dutch schools, huge North African population, a big Islamic population. But there they were teaching in a unified way, and partly for good reasons, or partly well-motivated reasons, I don't know if they're good reasons, namely for equality, that everybody got the same curriculum, but the backgrounds were totally different. And the cultural receptivity was very different. And I think we need to build diverse programs, and that's actually why I would encourage the private sector, the public sector, and institutions, churches, various other institutions that aren't necessarily governmental institutions, to work with governments to provide this diversity of arrangement. So I think that's important. But the parental engagement is important. When Perry and many of these programs have worked precisely because they've engaged not just the child, but they've engaged the parents to work with the child. And it's not like there's a curriculum for parenting, but there really is some difference. Like, for example, the Harlem Children's Zone that Jeffrey Canada has built this baby college and has constructed a curriculum. What he noticed was that in certain communities, there was much less of an environment of encouraging the child. And to teach the parents the value of encouraging, to have more affirmatives than negatives. I raced through the Hart and Risley study, but if you go back, let me see if I can go back quickly enough. Yes, here we are. If you go back, you can see that in the first graph here on the right-hand side, between the welfare and the professional class, many more prohibitions, negatives, than affirmations in the welfare families, many more affirmations than prohibitions in the professional families. And I think that's the kind of teaching of parents. And a student of mine at the University of Pennsylvania has surveyed, along with some pediatricians and anthropologists, knowledge of parenting. So, you know, there's a lot of ignorance out there. And so there is some value, but I think you've got to offer it in a way, not saying you are ignorant parents or you're bad parents, but offering advice. So when Olds tells teenage girls it's not a good idea to smoke and drink when you're carrying the child, many of these women voluntarily decide not to drink and smoke, even though they'll take it on later or resume their habits after the child is born. That kind of information is scarce, and it's scarcer than we think it is. So it's very common for us to kind of generalize some certain experiences we may have had, but when we understand that there's a wide diversity of knowledge and that actually there can be provision of knowledge, but it has to be voluntary. You just can't, look, we had these extreme environments a few years ago, 50, 70 years ago, where children were taken away from their own parents, put in orphanages. These were Indian children or indigenous children. The same was true for the Aborigines in both in Australia and the native population in Canada. And that led to horrendous consequences. You can't take the parent out of the life of the child. You've got to work with the parents, and you've got to make sure that they're on board. And so that's where the voluntarism has to go, has to be. It has to be voluntary.
Okay, thank you. We've got a huge stack of questions, but we really only have time for about 2 more. I'm getting the hook.
Okay,
Earlier this evening I was given the hook, but I'm getting the hook. We got 2 more questions.
Okay.
The next one is, you mentioned a concern regarding the cost per child that Oak Park is discussing. Can you please elaborate?
Well, I heard the figure $280 per child. Is that, I don't know if that was correct. Is that a bad?
So, yes.
Across all 54. Oh, I don't know how it's targeted. So some of these programs have been much more expensive. No more expensive than what the annual cost would be of a high school student, for example, in Oak Park. But that's much more than $280. And so the only thing I would worry about is dilution. Early childhood programs can cause harm. It's not a question of saying that, just working with children isn't guaranteed to produce benefit. We know that if you take children away from the parents, you put them in warehouses, you basically remove them from any kind of stimulation, even the kind of encouragement that the mother might give, even an uneducated mother, even a mother who might be giving more prohibitions and affirmatives, that sometimes you can make the child's behavior problems worse. And so there really has to be a baseline sense of quality. And understanding what's going on in these programs, I think, is not that well understood yet. And it really involves a kind of supplementary parenting. It really involves a very intensive activity where you're not just taking kids in and showing them the alphabet. It's not like a baby Einstein program. It's really a program where you're saying, look, where is Johnny or where is Sally at right now? And where is the next step of knowledge? And you sort of scaffold that knowledge. And you that's a very individuated process. And that's a costly process. That's what middle-class children get all the time from their parents. And I think that's why the program quality should be high. So I don't want to comment on programs I don't really know. I just thought the figure was a little low because, I would say the figure would probably be closer, much higher, if you thought about hiring 1 teacher for 3 children over the course of a year. That's a pretty expensive proposition. And that, I think, on the other hand, would have very substantial benefits. But also, if you're talking about relatively advantaged kids, then no. I mean, I'm not even sure you should be thinking so much. It depends really on, there's a whole issue about how you finance these programs, whether you want them to be universal or not. I think, though, the important factor should be, though, that you at least make sure the child is getting that stimulation and encouragement, and the parents maybe are also getting the lessons of how to help the child get that stimulation and encouragement.
Okay. Another parent question. Regarding involving parents, is there any research on parental gifts or rewards for performing? Example, giving parents a Target gift card for attending parent-teacher conferences. Is this a beneficial way to get parents involved in early years?
Well, there's some discussion about that. Economists have a bias towards incentives. But there's a big literature, actually, not only in economics, but also in psychology, about sort of intrinsic versus extrinsic rewards. I don't know if you've heard the term, but I think it's obvious and important. I think the question is, if we pay people to do things, what we've learned, and whether it's children for grades or parents for better parenting, I think the danger is that when you reduce the reward or remove it, unless you imagine a permanent incentive, you can sometimes actually reduce the effort once the reward is removed. That's been the finding, for example, in paying for grades and various other things. So I think we want to be really cautious about these programs. It sounds like I'm an anti-economist. I think paying people to do things certainly promotes that activity as long as you pay them. But I actually think that both for children and for parents, creating maybe a deeper motivation, so that's the so-called intrinsic reward, understanding why certain things might be beneficial for your child and motivating it that way than through a direct cash payment can be useful. We know that Roland Fryer's experiments in New York, for example, failed. I mean, he was paying kids cash, giving them cell phones for better grades. And the trouble is it had no lasting effect. Once you remove the rewards, in some cases the children were doing worse because they expected to be paid for these things. You remove the rewards, they weren't getting payment. So I think we want to be really careful about incentives of those sorts. And so Progressa is another example, moving out of the United States but to Mexico. It's a program that many people trumpet as a great success. Parents were paid money for keeping their kids in school and for keeping their kids healthy, sending them to clinics and so forth. Now, the question is how substantial those benefits were. It certainly moved more children into schools, moved more children into clinics. But the evaluations, if you really look at an honest amount of what the rate of return is, show pretty small benefits. And so I think you might want to think of other ways to motivate people. I think information can be very powerful, maybe more powerful. You tell people, like the drinking and smoking example for teenage mothers, that's not a cash reward, that's an information system. And saying, I'm giving you more information. Here, you can make what you want of it, but most of these mothers see this child as something very important in their lives, and they weren't aware, or maybe weren't very fully aware, it hadn't been salient anyway, that these kinds of behaviors were harmful, and they don't want to harm their child, more or less. Most parents don't. And so I think that can be a very effective incentive, and that's been studied to be effective. Cash rewards, a little more pessimistic about, but it certainly would motivate the behavior in the short run. I don't know if it's going to stick. That's the real question. Paying for grades, I personally don't think is a great idea, even though I did it.
Thank you. That concludes the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very, very much.